Hi, and welcome to the first part of the chapter 4 on trade, factor availability, and factor proportions. So, just to review, we're asking 4 fundamental questions about trade. What's the basis for trade? What are the gains from trade? What are the effects of trade on production and consumption in each country, and what are the distributional effects of trade in each nation? One of the things about the Ricardo model that we've seen so far is that it doesn't give very good answers to some of these questions. So for instance, one of the issues with the Ricardo model is that it only has really one factor of production, and that is labor. If you remember, there are 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, which is plant, machinery, and equipment, and entrepreneurship. So in this chapter, we introduce the idea really of a second factor of production, capital, in other words, plant, machinery, and equipment. First of all, we want to change the paradigm which we've been working with, which is straight-lined PPCs. In other words, having a constant opportunity cost when we move from the production of one good to the production of the other good. The way in which we're going to change this is by having increasing marginal costs. So as we move from producing more of one good to the other good, basically one industry is expanding, the other industry is contracting. We've said that so far we said that happens at a constant rate. Now we're going to change that assumption. And this fits in with the idea of the law of diminishing returns. And as you expand the output in one industry, what you're going to do is give up more of the production of the other industry. The reason why that is, as we're going to see in a second, is that, of course, when you move factors over from doing one thing to doing something else, some of those factors are really not appropriate for the production of that other good. In other words, things like, if you've got a machine that produces cloth and you're moving it over to producing wheat, it's not going to be very good at that particular mode of production. And also with individuals, if you've got someone who's a farmer and you're telling them that they should be working in a factory, then clearly their output is not likely to be high, because probably they will have chosen farming as a profession because they have a comparative advantage in that area. So that's another way of looking at this. The result when you do this, though, is a production possibility curve that slopes outwards. So here we have the PPC, and we can see as we move down that PPC, the slope changes. That means that the opportunity cost changes. So as we produce more cloth and less wheat moving down the curve, what we're seeing is that we're having to give up increasing amounts of wheat to move down the curve until we hit that point S2 in the top diagram. So why are these increasing cost curves bowed outward in shape, and why are they more realistic? Well, as I've said already, factors of production are more suited to doing certain things than other things. And if you, as a country, move towards producing a lot more of one good, then clearly the factors that were producing the other good are going to be less suited to their new role. And so you're going to give up a lot more production in the good that you're moving away from. Here he just goes into the explanation I've already given here. There's several kinds of factor inputs: land, labor, unskilled labor, capital. Different products use different inputs in different proportions. So as I said, certain products may require more skilled labor than unskilled labor, and therefore moving the factors of production around into different industries may not yield very high output. Obviously, as a country, as you're doing this, you're going to move the factors of production that have the most adaptability first, and then you start to move the ones that have least adaptability last. So here we can see that, the production combination will depend as well on the price ratio that competitive firms face. So this is prices in terms of the trading ratio, if you like. We're not dealing in prices actually, we're just dealing with the rate at which one good exchanges for the other good, the barter rate, if you like. So suppose that the market price of cloth in terms of wheat is 2W per C, in other words 2 units of wheat for each unit of cloth. So if you're looking to trade that or thinking about producing that, you're either going to see one of 3 conditions at any production point. You're either going to see that the opportunity cost of producing another unit of cloth is less than 2 units of wheat per unit of cloth. So you're going to try and make, in that case, you would try and make more cloth and take resources away from wheat. The opportunity cost clearly is less than 2W over C. It could be more than 2W over C that you can sell it for. Then you're going to try and make less cloth and move more into wheat. So the wheat production. So the opportunity cost is greater. The slope of the PPC is steeper than 2W over C or equal to 2W over C. Then you're producing the right amount. So there's no reason to shift away any production between cloth and wheat. Okay, the next part of this chapter deals with indifference curves. Now, you should have seen indifference curves in your foundations course, but indifference curves essentially show the various combinations of consumption. So far in this chapter, we've been dealing with production, right? So the important point here is we're moving away from production to look at consumption. So some people call these social indifference curves, incidentally. So indifference curves show the various combinations of consumption quantities that are going to lead to the same level of utility or happiness. And they show how economic well-being of a whole group depends on the whole group's consumption of products. So in other words, when we look at our kind of framework here, where we've got wheat, units of wheat consumed on the vertical axis, units of cloth on the horizontal axis, we can draw an indifference curve, and they're labeled I0, I1, I2, showing the bundles of wheat and cloth that would leave us indifferent. So if we're looking at that first indifference curve, I0, we are indifferent. So we don't care whether we consume 80 units of wheat, 20 units of cloth, or going to the other extreme, 20 units of wheat and 80 units of cloth. And obviously there are points in between. So B is another point where we're consuming 40 units of wheat and 40 units of cloth. We're indifferent between these points. In other words, what's this saying? It's saying as we reduce the consumption of one good, we're going to need increasingly large amounts of the other good to leave us at the same level of happiness. Here's a long description of that. I'm not going to go through this, but it's there. So one thing about indifference curves is they're specific to the individual. They're always downward sloping because as we give up one good, we're going to substitute it for the other good. And they're always concave to the origin, meaning as we give up more and more of one good, we're going to need, increasing amounts of the other good to make us indifferent. And there are an infinite number of indifference curves, and they specify or they define what we call the indifference map. These indifference maps, as they're different levels of happiness, they cannot cross. Those indifference curves cannot cross. They are what we call a unique mapping. Why are these useful? Well, they're useful because they show what the country or what the community would like to consume. And, one of the problems here is in macroeconomics is adding up these individual indifference curves, but we don't need to worry too much about that because we're going to deal with this in a kind of a nebulous way for society as a whole. So national indifference curves, if you like, or what he calls community indifference curves, I often would label as social indifference curves. So here we can look at consumption and production together. So we know that in autarky, without trade, the US is going to be self-sufficient, and it's going to find the combination of the two goods here, wheat and cloth, that maximizes the happiness of the consumers. But with trade, we have a different problem. With trade, we're going to be exporting wheat to the rest of the world and importing cloth. So we need to know what the preferences are of our consumers as to how much wheat to export and how much we can export and how much cloth we should be importing. So we can show this on a diagram here. We've got our outwardly bowed production possibility curve. So you can see that's the line there, the curve there that has the blue inside the indifference curve, not the indifference curve, the PPC. And we've also plotted indifference curves here. So that's labeled I1, I2, I0, I1 and I2. So what we're going to do is we're going to push out those indifference curves, because as we move those out, those refer to higher levels of happiness, higher levels of satisfaction, if you like, until one is just tangential, just touching the PPC. That will indicate in autarky the number or the amount of wheat we should be producing, which you can see here is at S0, in other words 50 units of wheat and 40 units of cloth. Notice here as well that the price ratio here is important, because that's the price ratio that comes out of this exercise. So in other words, once we reach S0, we're going to look at what's the slope both of the indifference curve and of the PPC at that point. And that determines the rate of exchange between wheat and cloth. And in this case, it turns out to be 2WC. It might not be in another example, for example. Why is S1 not optimal? Well, it's because you can see that the trade-off that the community desires, which is the slope of the indifference curve at S1, is different from the slope of the PPC at S1. So in other words, the trade-off here between the two is different for producers than for consumers. So we're not maximizing our satisfaction. In other words, we can get to a higher level of satisfaction. We can push that indifference curve outwards until we just touch the PPC, and at that level we will have basically an optimal situation. So here we're going to move on to indifference curves and production possibilities without trade, the long description. So here you can read that and you can see what this says, which is what I've just gone through. Now, with trade, the diagram becomes a lot more complicated. Why? Because we have the diagrams we had before, but with the Ricardian model, but now we have the downward, the outwardly bowed PPCs. So you can see those there for the US and the rest of the world in the top part of the diagram. So that's labeled A. And then in the bottom part of the diagram, we can actually map this back into our demand and supply diagrams that we had originally. Okay, so it becomes a bit more complicated in the top part of this diagram. Why? Because as we know, we're going to end up at S0. So looking at the left-hand top diagram, S0 in autarky. But when we trade, we're going to trade at a different rate when we open up to trade. And let's say that that's 1 W over C. So 1 unit of wheat for 1 unit of cloth. Well, now we can say that that would cause us to specialize in the good that we have a comparative advantage in, and we know that that's wheat. So we'd actually produce a lot more wheat, and we can see that at point S1. And we'd produce a lot less cloth. We can see that as well, reducing from whatever we're producing at S0, which looks like 40. We can see that we're halving the production of cloth to 20. At the same time, for the rest of the world, they're doing the opposite. In other words, they start off with S0 in autarky, but they're going to move to S1. So they're going to cut their production of wheat from 30 to 15, but increase their production of cloth to 100 from 80. Now what they're going to do, or now what we're going to do is then look at where the consumption points are. And the consumption points, now that we've got a different price line, which is W over C, we're going to push that utility, that indifference curve outwards to higher level of happiness and satisfaction until we end up at the point where we're going to consume. So for the US, it will be at C1. We can see where that is. That's a higher indifference curve. And notice it's tangential to that price line again. So now it's not tangential to the PPC because, of course, we're not trying to optimize in relation to our production, domestic production, because our domestic production now is less important because we've got the foreign production also that can help out by us importing. So we're going to end up at point C1. And that means we're going to be producing 40 units of wheat. We're going to be consuming 40 units of wheat and consuming 60 units of cloth. So think about it. If we're producing 80 units, but we're only of wheat, but only consuming 40, we must be exporting 40 to the rest of the world. You can see that in the diagram on the right, where the difference between 15, where is the amount that after trade the rest of the world will be producing of wheat, versus 55, the point which is tangential to their indifference curve, and the price line, the new price line, is at C1. So the difference between 15 and 55 is 40. Similarly, for the horizontal axis, the difference between the amount with trade that the US will be producing of cloth is 20, but they were consuming 60 units of cloth. So that difference is 40. So in other words, the foreign country, the rest of the world, must be producing 100, but it gives up 40, so that's 60. So that takes us to the point C1. We can map that into the bottom diagram because we know that the US exports wheat and imports cloth. So if we put this into a demand-supply diagram, we can see the price of cloth on the vertical axis is W over C, so it's the relative price of cloth, if you like. And we can see the gap there between demand and supply for cloth is the amount of cloth that we import. And you can see, so this is just relative to cloth on the bottom diagram. The amount of cloth that the rest of the world exports to us is there on the right-hand side diagram. That's the end of part 1.